My name is Johannes Drielsma. I have a Dutch name, but I'm born and educated in Australia, and now living in Europe for the last 16 years and representing Euromines, so European mining operations, for the last 10 years. An environmental engineer by background, and I started my career with the mining industry in Australia, as I said, representing mining companies here in Europe for the last 10 years. So Euromines has as members about 17 national mining federations, including Svemin in Sweden, and about 20 or 21 direct company members, including companies like LCA and Boliden and Lundin Mining. So that's who we represent. It translates to about 100% of mine production for a lot of the metals. I think a little bit more than 50% of production for zinc, but then also a lot of industrial minerals. Altogether 42 different metals and minerals. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is an area of work that I think still needs to be done. So title slide then. So I've been asked to talk about the state of the art of life cycle assessment as it's applied to mineral resources. This is an area where I think a lot more research is needed. There's been about 20 years of research into this question by experts in the field of life cycle assessment. And unfortunately, very little of that research has been done in cooperation with anyone who is an expert in mineral resources or mining. And so as LCA becomes more popular and more referred to in policies or regulations, I have been drawn into the field, and I have become aware of some very worrying problems that need to be fixed if we want LCA to help us to become more efficient. I should say at the outset that we generally do support life cycle thinking and life cycle approaches. We do believe that it's important that whole life cycles be taken into account when trying to understand environmental impacts and trade-offs of certain decisions, right? And mining companies do use LCA internally to uncover available opportunities to improve efficiencies, etc., etc. So we're familiar with the tool, we support the tool, but we don't support the way it is applied in some of the literature at the moment, and the way it's being proposed in some new policies and regulations. So what have I seen so far when looking at life cycle assessment applied to natural resources? I have seen a lot of confusion. I've seen quite a bit of resistance in all quarters, also in our quarter, amongst the mining companies, and a lot of frustration. So in my view, that probably comes from some very fundamental things, like there's no common vision about what natural resources are to begin with, why they need to be protected in an environmental assessment framework, what's the threat that natural resources face. There's no common vision of that. Worse, there are some competing or entrenched visions, and in some cases some unwillingness for people to move out of their comfort zone and imagine that there might be other ways of looking at these things. I think the resistance comes from mostly unaligned incentives. So of course academics have their own incentives for exploring ideas, developing tools, trying to solve societal problems. Mining companies are very, very focused on their own incentives, and their incentives are to make a profit and profit from the opportunity to provide society with the raw materials that it needs. And so what I've found is that often people like to speak on our behalf, particularly in the life cycle assessment area, where in trying to tackle issues that they see or problems that they want to solve, they want to understand how the supply of raw materials takes place. They want to understand our behavior as mining companies. And so often they're assuming what our incentives might be, or they're misunderstanding them. In some cases, they might even just be dismissing our incentives as not necessarily as important as theirs. So there's a lot of doing going on. As I say, we're using LCA in our companies for our own purposes. The academics are developing models. There's a lot of doing, not a lot of listening between the different communities. And then, that becomes frustrating, right? So when you have no common vision or no common incentive to work together, you don't work together. So in my daily job, I do face the problem that the mining companies, they don't have people available with sufficient time to spend collaborating with the academics or the LCA practitioners, or even our downstream customers who are using LCA and in a naive fashion. The mining people don't have the time to collaborate. But I think if there were shared incentives, we could justify spending the time. So, and then another huge frustration for the LCA people in particular is that there's a lack of freely available data with which to tackle these problems. And we're often having to explain to people, well, the data that we use in the mining companies to address these issues is often commercial data. It costs money. We pay a license agreement or we pay for access to the data we need to solve these kinds of questions. And the reason we have to pay for that is because it's expensive data to generate. People spend real time and sweat to pull together the information that we need to make our long-term forecasts. And so all of this means that there have been a lot of amateur forays into each other's areas of expertise. So I've seen a lot of clumsy amateur attempts in the literature to speak on our behalf or to describe how the mining industry works. And I'd be the first to admit that I'm guilty of making amateur forays into the area of life cycle assessment or mineral economics in trying to explain to them how they may have misunderstood the supply of raw materials. So this is the broad context, right? That's why I think we have some research needs to address here. So
you're saying I'm assuming.
Yep. Third slide now. Sorry. Third slide. A very quick introduction to LCA in case any of you haven't come up against it before. It's a method of tallying up all the flows of energy and materials that take place in the different stages of producing, using, and disposing of or recycling a product. So it's very much coming from a product focus and looking upstream, if you like, looking upstream, looking downstream. Although the mining industry also does use life cycle thinking to look at its processes. The mainstream tool is looking at environmental impacts of a product across the entire life cycle. So all of these steps take in inputs, either from other product systems. So a car assembly plant will take in a component from a component manufacturer or from nature. And then they have other outputs, so they're putting products on the market, maybe they have some byproducts, and maybe they have some emissions to going to nature, maybe they have some waste products going to a waste system, a landfill, or maybe going to nature as well. Okay, that's the general view of the general framework for LCA. Now, when it comes to natural resources, the current framework, the orthodoxy, if you like, is to think of natural resources as parts of nature, naturally occurring, sitting there in nature. The orthodox is also to think of those as fixed stocks. So you've probably often heard that iron ore, the metals that we extract, are non-renewable. That we only have one planet, therefore the total amount of this stuff is somehow fixed, and when we extract it, we're taking away from that fixed stock. That's the paradigm within which LCA has been developed. And then the idea is that bringing that input in from nature must have, therefore, some environmental impact upon nature. But what are resources, actually? If you go to the next slide and press the mouse once, you should see a circle around the left-hand part of the slide. Interestingly, when LCA practitioners talk about natural resources, they define all of them in terms of reserves. So there's already some kind of mismatch of terms there. For LCA, resource equals reserve, and they speak about different categories of reserve, if you like. The ultimate reserves, which we would tend to call the crustal content, so that's the absolute total that's sitting in the Earth's crust. Then they talk about things like reserve base, and then they talk about economic reserves. Then if you press the mouse another time, you'll see that in our industry, we have a very specific definition for resource, and it covers far fewer things than LCA covers. So we talk about defined resources, mineral resources, and the mineral resources will include as a subset mineral reserves. And we have reporting codes that govern how we must refer to these things. And if we refer to these things in an incorrect manner, then we will have sanctions from the stock markets. I'm speaking of obviously for the case of listed companies, but even private companies will have their own internal rules for how they define their own resources and reserves, and I would suggest that they're probably often following the convention of the rules that are applied to the listed companies, right? So our concept of what a resource is very different to LCA concept of resource. And something that the LCA people don't tend to mention, but we do, is the category of undiscovered resources. So material that we are fairly confident will be extractable sometime in the future, but we haven't found it yet. And I've seen studies from the USGS, for example, that use quite sound, science-based methods to estimate how much undiscovered resource might be out there for things like copper. And they're based on what we know about ore genesis. And I sometimes have to explain to LCA people that we do understand certain means by which ores have been produced by the Earth over billions of years, but we don't necessarily understand all of them. And our geologists are still unraveling some of those mysteries. And it may be, it has happened in the past, that when we learn a new way to interpret the information that we have from the geology, that we'll discover a whole new class of ore bodies. Okay? Now, if you press the mouse one more time, you should see a red rectangle, which is indicating to you that the EU has recommended that for the purposes of estimating environmental impacts of products in LCA, people should use the reserve base, which is a statistic that was produced regularly by the USGS, but is no longer produced. And you will see that the reserve base corresponds to what we would call defined plus some potential resources. But it's by no means anything like the total amount of resource that is out there in the environment. Then if you move to the next slide, you should see 4 graphs for base metals, which are indicating or proving to us that actually mineral resources, known mineral resources, are not fixed. They're not depleting. So the blue parts of the columns are the production of these different metals. So you can see that the increase in size of the blue column is the annual production. And then the red part of the column is the amount of material that has been identified in remaining reserves. So then the increase in size of the red portion is the annual increase to the remaining reserves after the production. So you should see from this that generally speaking, our industry has a tendency to provide on an annual basis more mineral reserves than it extracts, which is difficult to get across to LCA practitioners because they're thinking all the time about a fixed quantity, and we're taking away from a fixed quantity. We're not dealing with a fixed quantity. We're dealing with a known portion of the total, and we're adding more to it than we take away. Okay, next slide. Another way of looking at that, if you consider the vertical axis being the quantity of resources, and I've tried to represent this as a log scale to show you the vast difference in these quantities. You know, at the top you have the crustal content, which you can find in the periodic table. The periodic table lists the average crustal concentration for all the elements. You have the known reserve base, which was published by the USGS previously, and then you have known mineral resources, which are what we report to the stock exchanges when we find things. At the bottom you have the different life cycle stages of a product: extraction, beneficiation, metallurgy, etc., all the way through to use and recycling. So you can see that indeed, when producing a product, we take material out of the reserve base, out of the Earth's crust, and then if you consider that we recycle some of that back, well, then you can imagine that we're sort of somehow giving it back. So because LCA at the moment refers to the reserve base of USGS, if you click the mouse once, you should see where the LCA depletion result comes from. It's some sort of net lowering of the known reserve base due to the material that has come in to this product system. But then if you click the mouse a second time, you should uncover the activity of mineral exploration. That's the activity that is giving us the increase of those red bars in the previous slide. And it changes the baseline in a way. So if you imagine that, well, a certain amount of that exploration activity is due to the demand for this product. We don't explore for no reason. We explore when there's a demand. So some portion of that exploration activity can be attributed to this product system. Then, if you click the mouse a third time, you'll see that the accretion of the known reserve base, that is happening in reality. So we have a problem. LCA is misrepresenting reality at the moment. So next slide. Many of you will understand immediately why this is happening, but this is a slide coming from Newmont Mining, gold mining company, from a workshop that we held last year to try to explain some of this to LCA people. Try to explain to them that resources and reserves, the way we define them, are much more defined by economic factors and indeed geopolitical factors related to investment risk than anything to do with the environment. Yes, of course, the environment has a role in forming these ore bodies, and the average grade of that ore body is some sort of environmental phenomenon. But the decision about whether or not to invest in mining that material is very much based on investment risk. And it's the decision about whether to invest that drives the definition of resources and reserves. Okay, so moving right along to the next slide. It also means that the reserve base data that has been generated by the USGS doesn't even mean the same thing for different materials. It's not consistent across the different materials. So if you click once, you should see an explanation of the graphs on the right. The top graph is different statistics for iron ore. The iron ore reserve base is the red line. You should look at the red lines of each of these graphs. Now, it's fluctuated over recent years depending on the market demand. So when we have high demand reflected in the higher prices, we explore more. And when we explore more, we increase the reserve base. And so that makes sense. We've had an increase in demand for iron ore, particularly in the last 10 years. But interestingly, the USGS estimate of the total world resources, the blue line at the top, has remained unchanged. Now, my interpretation of this is that the industry sees there are 800 gigatons of resources out there and feels quite comfortable. Oh, that's plenty. So most of our exploration activity for iron ore has likely been focused on converting those resources to reserves. So just doing the extra work to confirm that we can actually extract this iron ore at a profit. And you'll probably find that most of that exploration resulting in the increase of the reserve base has happened around existing mines. Now, if you click the mouse one more time, we can look at the case of copper, the middle graph, where the reserve base has also increased over time, but the world resources have actually tripled. And the way I interpret this graph is to say that, well, the world resources of copper are less satisfying than for iron ore. We think we might still need some more, so there's been more exploration activity and quite possibly more greenfield exploration activity, which has uncovered a vast amount of extra mineral resources. So the world resources have tripled. And then if you click one more time, the bottom graph refers to indium, and the reserve base, the red line there, is difficult to believe, in fact. So the USGS stopped reporting after 2007. The 2007 result was much higher than previous results. That resulted from including some Chinese data, and the USGS lost confidence in that reserve base. And now my interpretation, and you'll also see that there's no blue line there for world resources. No one has estimated world resources of indium. And I think that's easy to explain. That's because we don't explore for indium. Indium is a byproduct of zinc mining, and whereas USGS was suggesting that there might have been 6,000 tons of indium in the reserve base, the International Indium Association was already saying there were 15,000 tons present in zinc reserves. And then if you press if you go to the next slide, an academic in Australia has even estimated that there might be as many as 70,000 tons of indium only in the zinc mineral reserves. We know that there's plenty of indium in the zinc mines, therefore we're not exploring for indium, therefore we're not constructing data that would give you a picture of the reserve base for indium, okay? Now, what that means is that in a lot of the LCAs that are being undertaken today, things like indium and vanadium are popping up as causing the most environmental impact. But I hope you'll see and understand that actually it's an artifact of the data that they're using. It's nothing to do with environmental impact. Okay, so next slide. This table, don't try to read the whole table. This table comes from a publication that we recently put in the International Journal of Life Cycle Assessment, where we looked at the different LCA methods applied to resources and tried to understand what are they actually measuring. So each of them says that they want to measure environmental impact. They want to measure depletion of the natural resource in the natural environment. However, what most of them are measuring is some kind of availability of resources, availability for human use. And then you'll see that on the data that they use is resource estimates or reserve estimates or even ore grades sometimes. So the only method that remains true to the original objective of measuring depletion of the total stock from the natural environment is the top method, which was developed 20 years ago, where they use crustal content. The other methods are no longer measuring impact on the natural environment. They're trying to understand impacts on availability of resources. Next slide. So if we go back to our framework for LCA, I would put it to you that rather than natural resources being some kind of intrinsic property of the environment, if you click the mouse a couple of times, you'll see that I'm suggesting that resources actually are a product of another system. Resources don't exist in their own right. Resources are identified through work, and if you click the mouse a third time, you'll see that I'm suggesting that exploration is the missing system. So there should actually be another life cycle stage at the far left of this slide called exploration, and that's how resources are produced from the environment. And so then if we're having an impact on known resources, are we really having an impact on nature? Are we having an impact on the environment? Or are we having an impact on that other system, that exploration system, or that supply system? Next slide. So what I would like to encourage you to do in responding to this call for funding is to have a look at some of this to-do list I have here. I think we need to improve the philosophy that is behind LCA at the moment. And I think we need to correct some false assumptions. So down the left-hand side, I've listed some of the assumptions that are currently made for LCA. Things like resources exist in nature independently of us. LCA practitioners are interested in quantifying the use value of resources, but they talk about the use value of resources as some sort of objective intrinsic property that doesn't change over time. The assumption that resource occurrences are known and can be characterized, so that the approach that is taken, this fixed stock approach, suggests that we already know where it all is. And I continually read in the literature that the mining industry mines high-grade deposits first, so that over time we've always progressed from high-grade deposits to lower-grade deposits. So all of the future extraction will be lower grade than today. So that suggests that we already know where it all is, and we're just making a very calculated progress through the inventory. Based on the way the framework of LCA is presented, it seems like mineral exploration doesn't exist, or they've assumed that it's negligible. As I've said, the assumption is that mineral resources are fixed, they're depleting, and they're non-renewable, and that mineral resources get dissipated by continued use. So in the sense that when we bring mineral resources into a product system, what happens as a result is that mineral resource is less available. And then, in the current thinking, resource availability is seen as some sort of intrinsic characteristic of the environment. You saw all those methods that claim to be measuring environmental impact, and they're actually assessing availability. And so there's some sort of inherent assumption that changes to resource availability are environmental impacts. Now, I think there are some undeniable facts that we need to bring to the LCA field, and I've put those in the black box there. First of all, mineral exploration is an essential process that we use to create mineral resources. You cannot have a product system in our economy without mineral exploration preceding it. Mineral resources are not fixed, but are regularly replenished by exploration, and we've got the data to demonstrate that. And with continued use, availability of mineral resources has actually increased. Okay, so that's a historic trend. but it's a pretty constant historic trend that I think we need to acknowledge and take account of. We have vastly increased our use of these things, and yet we have vastly increased their availability. And then some suggested lines of inquiry for research that you might undertake. Aren't resources defined by human assessment of the surroundings? Isn't it a subjective concept, the concept of a resource? It's the way we as humans look at things that we see in the natural environment. Aren't use values subjective and dependent on culture and technology? I think if you talk to economists, they would say the use value changes. The use value of something changes depending on how things can be used or how people choose to use them. So there are plenty of examples of materials that 100 years ago people didn't see any use for, and yet today are seen as very valuable for our new technologies. Isn't the vast majority of mineral resource actually still undiscovered? Now we know, it's a fact that there are undiscovered resources out there, but I mean, can we say with some confidence that it's the majority of them? This is what the mining bosses tell me. We've just scratched the tip of the iceberg. There's far more resource out there undiscovered than is in our inventories. Can we demonstrate that? Isn't resource availability a function of human needs and capacities? So why do we care that a resource is available? And what makes it available? Things like transport infrastructure, cost of inputs, energy inputs, water inputs. These things are what go together to make a resource available. I don't think it's the environment itself that makes resources available. And aren't changes in resource availability therefore actually economic impacts? So if we start producing a product that has an effect on the availability of resources for other people or other product systems, is that an environmental impact or are we having an economic impact? If you think in very simple terms about competition between different suppliers of the same product, you know, a company that outcompetes another company is having an economic impact on that other company. So these are things I think that where you may feel you already have the answers, but I think perhaps some collaborative research or some targeted research in the area of LCA might bring some of this thinking into the LCA sphere. And then if you go to the next slide, I think we need to fix the conceptual framework. So I hope you can interpret this graphic. I'm trying to represent a three-dimensional space here. I'm trying to suggest here that resources and services, these are sort of mental constructs that humans have, and indeed they might overlap with the natural environment in many cases. A lot of the things that we see as resources might be sitting in the natural environment, but we might need different tools to look at these things from different points of view. So if you look from the top down, if you're looking at the intrinsic value of these things, you know, the value of knowing that they're there. I'm quite happy that the Grand Canyon is sitting there in the United States. I would feel a sense of loss if we destroyed the Grand Canyon. That is an environmental value, an environmental view of the natural of these things. And despite the fact that there might be some iron ore sitting in the Grand Canyon, we could assess it in terms of intrinsic value in an environmental LCA. But if we look from the right-hand side, that's where we might indeed take a life cycle approach to understanding changes and impacts on resources, actually, natural resources. Some of those resources, as I say, sitting in the environment, others no longer sitting in the environment. Maybe they're man-made resources or some sort of synthetic resource or materials that are in use now and might become available in the future through recycling. So I think we need to present this kind of framework perhaps to the LCA people, because they're still stuck in a two-dimensional view and piling everything in and calling it all environmental impact. And I think there's a case to be made for splitting these things out. The natural environment obeys laws of nature, things that don't change with time. You can conduct experiments over time and repeatedly prove laws of nature that exist. So the natural environment can be defined physically in a way. Whereas I think resources and services, these are things that are defined in the human mind, they're defined metaphysically. And what determines whether something is a resource or not is not constant over time. It changes depending on our culture, our preferences, the technologies that we've developed. So that's one area where I think some research could be done. Perhaps you want to bring in a philosophy unit from your university to contribute. If you go to the next slide, I think we need to map different tools to needs of different decision makers. So again, at the moment, LCA is kind of promoted as the all-seeing single tool to solve all questions, and that's just not realistic. When we're talking about natural resources, there are a number of different players who have a number of different questions that they want answered, and some of those are environmental questions, but many of them are economic. And there may be some interest in looking at the very, very long-term prospects in terms of natural resources. Will we one day find that we cannot find any more, resources out there? But most of the questions that people are worried about tend to be in the short term, I think. So where can environmental LCA help us? With which questions, with which decisions can it help? And for which decisions might other tools, albeit life cycle based, be more helpful? If you go to the next slide, I think one area to explore in helping us to decide this might be looking at the time frame, the time frame over which the decision is relevant. And so we have a bunch of other tools that are in use today or proposed today that might be more relevant to certain questions. So for example, in the very short term, 1 to 3 years, as I say, we access commercially available data, and we put together reports, and we report to the stock market our production and our reserves. I mean, this is helping people make decisions. It's informing stockbrokers, banks, and the mining companies themselves. This is valid information, shouldn't be ignored, just because it's not incorporated in an LCA doesn't mean that it's not valid for that short-term decision making. And then there's some other tools and selected authors that I've listed here, who I think are actually addressing availability questions and therefore economic questions rather than environmental. And so maybe some of those tools need to be thought of as complementary to LCA. Interestingly, the top one, Schneider et al., has developed a tool called ESP. It's life cycle based, but ESP stands for economic scarcity potential. So I like that. I like the fact that Dr. Schneider is honest about saying, I'm developing an economic decision-making tool here. I'm using life cycle approaches, but what the result is an economic scarcity index, or figure. Whereas other people are doing similar things and still labeling it environmental impact. And then I think at the very far, very, very long term, I think the original method that was developed for LCA 20 years ago probably still has it right in terms of what is really depletion from the environment. Well, it's using the crustal content as your baseline and determining how much material you've subtracted from that crustal content. That is more of an environmental question, and probably less interesting for most decision makers. I struggle to think of any policy that governments have put in place to respond to something that might happen in 300 years' time. But nevertheless, it might have some academic interest if you really want to understand some of the environmental constraints, and it might help to highlight that this particular environmental constraint, running out, if you like, of mineral resources, is really a long, long, long way out. And then I think that's the end. My last slide is summing up to say, well, I think the state of the art in LCA needs help, and hopefully you'll be inspired to put forward some bids to do that.